Comfort comes naturally with the Sole Jasper Chukka. This lightweight, supportive shoe features a range of natural materials, including a revolutionary midsole made from recycled natural wine corks. Save $25 at yoursole.com/sustainabilitydefined. That's yoursole.com/sustainabilitydefined. All right, Definers, welcome back to Sustainability Defined, where Scott and I are here defining sustainability, one concept and one bad joke at a time. This is episode 81, a topic near and dear to my heart, Scott, on resiliency in residential real estate. Let's get cooking.
All right, so first, how do we define climate resilience in residential real estate? Second, why is residential real estate resilience important? Then what are the major climate forces impacting residential real estate? Why and how should both large asset owners and individuals invest in resilience? What policies are governments instituting to improve resilience in real estate? What can individual property owners do around climate resiliency? Because we always like to make this, what can you, the listener, do?
Bingo.
We've actually got two sections on that because we also have one on how you can get involved even if you don't own or invest in residential real estate. And then lastly, we'll tell you about our expert guests. So first, how do we define climate resilience in residential real estate?
So we're going to talk just two definitions here real quick, Scott. First, when we say residential real estate, we are talking anything from single-family homes and apartments to condos, townhomes, and basically any other fixed structure that folks live in.
Mm-hmm.
So that's residential real estate. Let's talk climate resilience. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, climate resilience is the act of successfully coping with and managing the impacts of climate change while preventing those impacts from growing worse. A climate resilient society would be low carbon and equipped to deal with the realities of a warmer world.
Right. And this is important because responding to climate change is no longer optional. I know basically every listener knows this, but we can't help but just mention this. And as we talked about in episode 80 on carbon removal, the recent climate change research shows that even years after that Paris Agreement, where we pledged to minimize global temperature rise by reducing our emissions, we haven't really made progress at the scale needed to meet those ambitious targets. In fact, on our current path, we're likely going to exceed 1.5 degrees within the next few decades, probably definitely sooner than we've thought. And in addition to decreasing future emissions to mitigate climate change impacts in the future, we also need to look towards other strategies like adaptation to the changing climate as well.
Right. So bringing these two terms together, when it comes to residential real estate and climate resilience, we can look to a definition used by ARUP, a global consultancy group dedicated to sustainable development, which defines climate resilience as the ability to recover from or to mitigate our vulnerability to climate-related events. Now, impacts of climate change are ever present and pose a great threat to our existing infrastructure. This is increasing the need to think about climate resilience and mitigation within our built environment.
For example, within residential real estate, the impacts of climate change are easy to visualize. The massive floods, wildfires, and hurricanes that we see with increasing frequency, they're having direct and immediate impacts on people's homes. In fact, as these natural disasters become more and more common, it becomes clear that, as ARUP describes, our existing buildings and infrastructure were designed for a climate that is disappearing. They believe that on our current trajectory, we'll continue to face these severe climate impacts. So we as humans will likely need to make fundamental changes in how we organize, design, and construct our built environment to become ecologically sustainable. Okay, so why is residential real estate resilience important?
Okay, let's start from the basics. We're talking about people's homes here, right?
Indeed.
So making sure our homes are safe for us, our families, and our friends is of utmost importance. The United Nations mentions that access to housing is a fundamental human right, especially housing that is safe, secure, habitable, and affordable. Now, jarringly, a recent U.S. Census Bureau survey reported that 3.1 million people were displaced by a natural disaster in 2023. Now, there are obviously very important social considerations at play here. The data showed that socially vulnerable groups like people over 65, those with less than a high school education, and those with lower household incomes or who were struggling with employment reported being displaced from their homes at a higher rate than other groups. Many marginalized groups are also more likely to live in areas that are at a higher risk for flooding or areas that can lack investment in storm protection measures.
It'd be interesting, Jay, if someone did a study looking at where those people were living and how much that displacement could be reduced by certain investments or certain practices. And seeing that cost versus the displacement. But anyway, another thing is that as extreme heat becomes a more frequent occurrence, lower income households and renters are less likely to have air conditioning, which has direct public health ramifications too. So climate adaptation and resilience, they're actually critical to social equality and increasingly central to city planning, especially given that communities that have been historically marginalized by land use policies face disproportionate risk as climate events become increasingly regular and severe. For more about sustainable city planning, you can check out episodes 41, Equity in Cities, and 51, Urban Greening.
Right. So we're talking why is residential real estate important? We're going to zoom out a touch and talk about the size of the real estate industry writ large. Okay. So we zoom out to the macro level and we can see that real estate generally as an industry is not something to just scoff at, right?
It's not a tiny home.
It's not. We're talking like gigantic mansion here, not including the value of residential homes, which itself is huge. The overall market value of the industry, so think apartment buildings, office buildings, retail centers, hotels, industrial space, etc., was estimated to be approximately $17 trillion at the end of 2018, which is the latest data we could find for the US. Globally, obviously, this number is much, much higher.
In addition, from an environmental perspective, real estate drives about 39% of total global emissions. Approximately 11% of these emissions are generated by manufacturing the raw materials that are used in buildings, like steel and cement, while the rest is emitted from buildings themselves and from the generation of the energy that powers buildings while they're occupied. We covered this topic back in episode 10 on sustainable building design. Now talking financial risk to real estate owners from lack of action. Due to the scale of this industry, a McKinsey study of a diversified equity portfolio found that absent mitigating actions, climate risk could reduce real estate annual returns toward the end of the decade by as much as 40%.
That's huge.
Yeah, not good for companies like yours, Jay, right?
No, but that's here. Wait for this spin. The good news is that just by using existing technologies, the real estate industry can make progress on reducing emissions while also saving money. For example, upgrading to more energy efficient lighting systems and installing improved insulation have positive financial returns. So here are just some kind of the low hanging fruit as far as actions that real estate owners can take. Homeowners actually can save money on their utility bills each month as well when they make simple upgrades like these that allow for electricity to be used more effectively. Today, newer technologies even make lower carbon heating and cooling systems, such as heat pumps and energy efficient air conditioning, more cost competitive in many markets and climates. These cost-effective upgrades can create meaningful change in emissions and utility bills, while also making homes more resilient against negative climate change impacts. Now, we just touched on a couple here. We'll get into more resilient strategies for residential real estate in just a few minutes.
Cool. So we know real estate is a massive industry responsible for a huge portion of our annual emissions. And then from a physical perspective, damages can add up quickly. The World Economic Forum found by looking at 185 extreme weather events from 2000 to 2019 that the global costs associated with climate change are around $2.8 trillion when accounting for the cost of damage to infrastructure, property, agriculture, and human health. This equates to about $143 billion each year. I know that's more than real estate, but real estate is definitely a big chunk of that. And then looking at real estate specifically, without sufficient action to prepare our infrastructure and buildings for floods, fires, droughts, and other hazards, the real estate industry faces current and future risks from increased property damage, operation costs, and business disruption, and then decreased property value, insurability, and rental and sales income.
All right, Scott, let's touch on the specific major climate forces that are impacting residential real estate just to kind of keep them forefront in our mind.
So when discussing how residential real estate is impacted by a changing climate, we can break down climate risks into two major categories. The first is acute physical risks. These refer to the increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events such as cyclones, wildfires, hurricanes, or floods. Of these acute physical risks, Seville's research indicates that floods are the most common. The second, chronic physical risks, refer to longer-term shifts in climate patterns, like sustained higher temperatures, that may cause sea level rise, droughts, or chronic heat waves that perhaps aren't as immediate or dramatic as, say, a devastating tornado. For more on sea level rise, check out episode 61.
Did you ever see the movie Twister, Scott?
Of course I did.
I am embarrassed to say that I actually never have.
I think there might be a sequel coming.
Oh.
Yeah.
Nice. It's relevant.
Many homes were damaged in that movie. So.
All right. So as we'll unpack, both of these categories of risks carry important ramifications for a given building's resilience and on an overall portfolio strategy of an organization that is building or investing in real estate. So let's look at what those organizations are doing to invest and implement more climate resilience into their plans. Then we'll turn to what we as individual property owners or renters can do in our own homes. So, Scott, I pose to you, why and how should large residential asset owners and individuals invest in resilience?
All right, so first let's focus on the why for large asset owners, where the needed scale of resiliency investments is immense. So the Urban Land Institute, or ULI, does a great job breaking this question down within its Developing Resilience Toolkit. And we're going to take a look at the 5 most important drivers, with most of this applicable to individual owners as well.
So first, there's enhanced value, marketability, and access to capital. Resilient buildings stand out, creating a competitive advantage that can be seen through faster leasing and sale, ability to attract tenants and customers, higher resale values, and better financing. Second, there's reduced insurance premiums. This is becoming an increasingly critical topic. As losses from climate events mount, insurance providers are offering discounts to customers that take proactive action to harden their properties. For example, the U.S. National Flood Insurance Program has long discounted premiums to owners for various flood mitigation measures.
And in 2022, FM Global, an American insurer, began offering a 5% resilience credit to owners who apply risk reduction strategies to their assets. And California became the first state to require insurers to reduce premiums for wildlife-hardened properties. Jay, this kind of reminds me of health insurance. I don't know if your health insurance does this, where they like pay for exercise classes or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Scott, it's actually funny you bring that up. We as a company do that too. And recently, I think last week, took a company walk around the block to get out and like move. So yes, similar idea.
Oh yeah. Walking one block, that'll solve everyone's health problem.
Well,
sure.
There may or may not have been like a Starbucks pit stop in there as well.
Oh my God. Sure.
Okay. Now, Scott, here's a stat that undoubtedly causes real estate owners, investors, and developers to lose sleep, I think myself included. According to Moody's, commercial real estate properties have seen insurance rates rise an average of over 7% per year since 2017. That's compared to a typical yearly increase of about 2 to 3%. And I'll tell you, Scott, as a line item that historically maybe hasn't gotten quite as much attention, all of a sudden, I think it's really making transactions and deals harder to actually accomplish.
So this is just like a general commercial real estate insurance for like a variety of things?
That's right. So derived from a number of inputs, yes, it is just kind of property insurance. You can get into both liability insurance and just actual physical damage.
Yeah.
But it's becoming increasingly problematic.
Yeah, especially if you probably want like good coverage, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so we first talked enhanced value, marketability, and access to capital. Second was reducing insurance premiums. Third is avoided losses from damage and disruption. Climate impacts cause property damages, raise maintenance expenses, and displace residents from residential buildings. However, proactive risk reduction investments can often cost far less than the damages that would have been incurred to an unprepared building. Now, cost and benefit analyses vary significantly by hazard type and likelihood, risk reduction measure, and building type. But FM Global did find that for every $1 a company spends to protect structures from hurricane, wind, and flood damage, estimated loss exposures decreased by an average $105 due to a reduction in risk of property loss and business disruption. Analyses completed by the National Institute of Building Sciences also found benefits of certain risk reduction strategies consistently outweigh costs by ratios of up to 13 to 1. So not quite as dramatic, but I think the point is that this upfront investment in resiliency pays off.
Okay, continuing down this list of why it's important for large asset owners to invest in resiliency. Number 4, we have lower costs of compliance with regulation. So resilience-related requirements are accelerating, whether from increased support in the U.S. Security Exchange Commission for adopting the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or through local legislation that we'll touch on further in a bit. And finally, Scott, we get returns for multiple stakeholders. For tenants, it delivers safe and reliable places to live and work. that create less stress and disruption, and they're willing to pay a premium for them. For lenders, investors, and insurers, it delivers protection for their capital. For governments and the wider public, it delivers reduced costs from climate impacts that they would otherwise pay.
Okay, so we talked about the why. Now let's review the how. This applies to real estate owners and occupants of any size, really. Let's first touch on the physical, tangible, residential resilience strategies that asset owners can deploy on the ground. Now, this is a complex field. We can't posit ourselves as experts, but don't worry, we'll be chatting with our expert guest soon. In the meantime, we're going to plug and link to an incredibly thorough report published by the UN Environment Program called A Practical Guide to Climate Resilient Buildings and Communities. It covers resiliency strategies to address everything from heat waves and droughts to sea level rise and flooding, with an important overarching emphasis on poverty and social discrimination.
So, we're not going to leave you with just a broad overview. We'll give you some of our favorite examples here too.
We're so good, Jay.
Just out of the kindness of our own hearts, right? So one of our first examples is keeping electrical, heating, and ventilation systems above flood lines or building walls to reduce moisture and risks associated with mold and fungal growth. I think that's pretty straightforward. Number 2, we have installing aerodynamic features to certain areas of a building's roof, where corners and eaves are normally subject to higher wind pressures. So Scott, now I'm thinking back to Twister of all these homes having their roofs just torn off, right? And last, and probably my favorite, is developing amphibious structures where, in the case of increased water levels, the building structure together with its support systems can separate from the mainland and float.
What?
So Scott, if I had to come up with goals for myself in like 20, 30 years, maybe an amphibious home is one of them.
But not to like stay on water permanently, but to like float for a little bit if it needs to, right?
Yes, although maybe my home will have like a motor attached to it, so when the water comes up, I can, scoot around.
It's like the duck, the car that can go in the water if it needs to.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So owners of real estate aren't sitting on their hands in relation to physical risks. For example, an informal survey of developers, owners, and investors across all real estate asset types and global regions found that 80% of respondents are either already using design and operation strategies to mitigate risk or will do so in the next 1 to 3 years.
Large organizations can also lean into data and analytics to help guide their strategies on both an individual asset and portfolio-wide level. These analytical tools can help owners better assess the vulnerability of current and potential properties to physical climate risks like flooding, storms, and sea level rise. They can also help owners evaluate the long-term financial performance of properties and identify opportunities to invest in properties or regions that are less vulnerable to climate risks.
All right, Jay, what about policies that governments are instituting to improve resilience in real estate?
Right. So I think it's probably impossible, Scott, for us to cover the gamut here, but in the interest of time, we'll summarize a few jurisdictions that are implementing policies related to real estate to achieve their own climate goals.
In the U.S., cities like New York City, Boston, Denver, Washington, D.C., and Seattle have all implemented building energy performance standards, which, Jay, you told me it's right to refer to it as BEPS. BEPS. These standards require that buildings meet certain criteria for energy or emissions-based performance. The U.S. Department of Energy states that these standards are helpful when combined with other building codes to help improve the energy and carbon goals for buildings. States like Colorado have implemented a statewide performance program as well. In addition, the state of Maryland, Montgomery County within Maryland, and the state of Washington are all progressing through draft pieces of legislation. All right, so these BEPS, they only apply to buildings. So some of you might be like, well, why are you talking about this if it's not for single-family homes? But it does apply for multifamily homes, like big apartment buildings. So still a lot of places that people live, the BEPS would come into play.
So listeners, if you're curious to know where these types of regulations are popping up across the country, we are going to link to a report from the National Building Performance Standards Coalition that breaks down which jurisdictions across the country are implementing these types of policies. As time goes on, more and more jurisdictions are likely to implement BEPS with the goal of minimizing real estate's contribution to climate change, and it's the responsibility of owners and operators to react accordingly. All right, Scott, we're talking high level here. Let's bring this back down to the individual property owner level and what they can do around climate resiliency.
Now, I'm sure a lot of our listenership owns many buildings, Jay, but for those that happen to just own a single home, let's do that. So one thing you can do is research climate risks in your area. You can do this by taking a look at available resources like riskfactor.com which is used by groups like Allstate and Redfin and is free for non-commercial use. Jay, I have not heard of this before. You've used it, I take it. Is it pretty user-friendly?
I think so, yes. I would encourage folks to poke around.
Okay. And you just put in your address or something?
Exactly. It gets pretty specific. So yeah, it was impressive.
Okay, you can also reference the Federal Emergency Management Agency or FEMA flood maps and other database resources. Though note that FEMA uses historical data to evaluate flood risk and does not consider future climate impacts when evaluating flood risk. Something they need to fix. And I know that's been a topic of discussion, but they need to get on it.
Oh, that's actually really interesting, Scott. I think, for example, we'll talk later with Becky about a use case where she and I connected on a property we were looking at. But I think she specifically called out, hey, here's some FEMA maps, but know that perhaps they're not the most forward-looking, and provided a few other sources that could do that. But I actually hadn't really thought about kind of the context of FEMA as you just described it.
The politics, yep.
Yeah. Well, listeners, the UN's Practical Guide to Climate Resilient Buildings and Communities that we mentioned earlier is another fantastic place to start for a broad swath of strategies. Of course, much of your own resilient strategy will be informed by where exactly you live, going back to that riskfactor.com, just plug in your address, as different regions face different threats from a changing climate. Here are a few examples. So, let's say you live in an area that's poised to get increasing amounts of rainfall. Well, installing rain gutters to redirect water away from the home can help mitigate flood risks. Or let's say you live in an area with immediate fire risk. Well, a metal roof can protect against wildfires. Upgrades like storm shutters, energy-efficient appliances, and drought-resistant landscaping can also help make your home more resilient against climate change impacts. Now, for more on the topic of sustainable landscaping techniques, check out episode 60.
And lastly, as individual homeowners, it's important you take the time to understand your homeowner's insurance. Just as you were saying, insurance rates are going up for commercial buildings, it's also going up for homes. And these insurance companies, they're citing increasing natural disasters, even going so far as to opt out of providing coverage to those in vulnerable states like Florida and California. Now, previously, obtaining homeowners insurance wasn't hard, but as climate change impacts increase in intensity and frequency, finding affordable coverage or coverage against fire or flood is becoming increasingly difficult. So if you're a homeowner, make sure you've got insurance, really understand what it covers what it doesn't cover, and then prepare accordingly if things do happen to your property. Okay, so how can listeners get involved, Jay, even if they don't own or invest in real estate?
Right. So, fortunately, Scott, the US EPA lists hundreds of strategies to help support climate adaptation. We're going to link to their full list in our intro notes, but here are some that listeners can act on immediately by getting involved with local organizations. Scott, you want to list them?
Improve education about the risks of developing in sensitive areas. Evaluate your city's development incentives to see if they encourage sustainable development. Advocate for climate resilient practices in your community. Assess and address the needs of people who might be particularly vulnerable and or are likely to be most affected, especially if they live in higher risk areas. All right, Jay, let's talk about our two guests.
That's right, Scott. So we will be speaking in just a moment with Becky Becker, a colleague of mine who is the Vice President of Environmental and Climate Adaptation at Equity Residential, or EQR. She's responsible for overseeing resilience efforts across EQR's 300 plus properties, consisting of over 80,000 apartment units all over the US. Becky has been with EQR for nearly 20 years and received her bachelor's degree in environmental policy from the University of Michigan. Go Blue, national champs. She also recently became an advisor to the new CRETech Climate Venture Coalition, a collaboration of the leading VCs in the built world, working together to accelerate investments in climate tech startups who are decarbonizing the built environment. We will then speak with Lindsay Brugger, Vice President, Urban Resilience at the Urban Land Institute, or ULI. ULI is a global nonprofit organization comprising more than 45,000 real estate and urban development professionals dedicated to advancing the Institute's mission of shaping the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. Lindsay leads ULI's Urban Resilience program to advance the real estate industry's understanding of climate risk, catalyze action to reduce vulnerability, and support communities in becoming more resilient. A licensed architect, certified passive house consultant, and frequent speaker, Lindsay has worked for over a decade at the intersection of resilience, adaptation, and the built environment. Let's do it. Comfort comes naturally with Sol Jasper Chukka. 16 years ago, Sol started a mission to reinvent sustainable footwear materials by launching their own wine cork recycling program called ReCork. ReCork has collected more than 130 million natural wine corks and innovated a new way of processing cork to create a flexible, cushioning, durable, natural alternative to synthetic foams. This groundbreaking material forms the midsole for the Sol Jasper Chukka, an everyday shoe made to show how exceptionally comfortable footwear made with natural materials can be. Get $25 off the Jasper Chukka at yoursole.com/sustainabilitydefined. That's yoursole.com/sustainabilitydefined. All right, Definers, welcome to our interview portion of our episode on real estate and resilience. We are thrilled to be joined today by Becky Becker, the Vice President of Environmental and Climate Adaptation at Equity Residential. So, Becky, thank you so much for taking time away from what I happen to know is a very busy schedule to chat with me and Scott today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jay and Scott. I'm excited to be part of this. I've not ever been on a podcast before. And Jay, it's exciting to be working with you outside of our regular capacity. So thanks for having me.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. So, Becky, we'll be diving into all kinds of interesting, compelling aspects of your work, but let's start closer to square one. So, in doing our research, we saw that you've held environmentally oriented roles your entire career. So, how would you say you first came to identify an interest in the environment?
Yeah, so I'm one of the odd ones in this field that actually has an environmental degree. But that started really young for me. Probably similar story that you've heard other times, but we spent a lot of time outdoors and in nature, and just really loved being outside and felt the calm from being surrounded by nature. But also I had a mom that I would say was ahead of her time with recycling and reuse. And we were the crazy ones sorting and making sure that the labels on our recycling were the ones that could be accepted back in the 80s before most people were really kind of having those conversations. So
I can sense the grin on Scott's face.
Oh my God. Becky, yes, you're my favorite.
And then I also, interestingly enough, one of my mom's cousins was working for the EPA in the 80s on their acid rain research and program.
Nice.
So kind of from a really early age, I was aware of kind of discussions around emissions, and maybe not in those words specifically, and their impact on our environment. But also that there was a whole world of like careers out there that could be related to science and environmental protection.
Jay and I talk a lot about how much we love our moms, so it's great that you've got a mom story as well. And Jay, I'm surprised you didn't do the whole like Go Blue Michigan thing here on the background.
Oh, that's actually a great point. Yes. So, Becky, I don't even know if you and I talk about Michigan enough, when we connect anyways, but yes, Go Blue.
Yes, Go Blue. Well, then that is actually the second part of my kind of interest in environment is, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I had a lot of interest in a lot of different things. So wanted to go to a big school that was good at a lot of things. And after taking, we had to take like a required freshman seminar of like a really small course, picked kind of a random environmental geology course, probably because it was at a good time and I didn't have to wake up early.
Fair.
But really loved it and found out some more about Michigan has a School of Natural Resources, which has now changed its name to like the School for Environmental and Sustainability, which was like a really small school within the big university, and decided to pursue a degree there in environmental policy. So really started to learn about kind of the opportunities around science and policy and business and regulations.
Yeah, so that sounds similar to my story where I went to Georgetown, didn't know, like environmental studies was not in my mind, saw the minor and just went forward from there. And even within my career path, I started as a lawyer and now lead sustainability for the metal can industry, which was why Jay was saying that I was smiling with all that focus on recycling. But can you talk to us about your career path? Like from Michigan, you got to EQR, You've been there, I gather, for like 20 years, which is amazing. Like, how would you describe your career path within the organization? And did you like create this role focused on environmental and climate adaptation? How did that come about?
Yeah, so right out of school, I did some environmental consulting for a little bit, which had a focus on environmental compliance. I was really interested in doing work with like fish and birds, and just that wasn't in the cards for me. But I found out I really liked like compliance and working with real estate as a consultant. Did a small stint in working for the Twinkie and Wonder Bread manufacturer.
Yum.
Didn't see that coming. Okay.
No, that was an interesting one. And then actually found my job at Equity through Monster.com. I don't know if you guys if that was before your time.
Oh, yeah, I recall.
Yeah, along with MapQuest and everything. Sure.
Yes, it was back in the MapQuest era. Never really thought that I would end up in the real estate industry. My parents actually owned a small real estate company back where I grew up, but it wasn't something I was interested in, and I went off to do something else and back in it. But I was originally hired to create and build out an environmental compliance program here. So at the time, our portfolio was much older. It was a lot of stock built in the 60s and 70s. And there were there still are a lot of regulations around asbestos and lead paint at multifamily buildings. And so initially that was really what I was doing. I was creating programs and getting us into like good shape from a compliance perspective. But then after like a year or two here, I think they recognized, and I also recognized all the other places I could start adding value with my experience and interests, and jumped into doing all of our environmental due diligence for acquisitions. Took on additional environmental programs like remediation of sites and stormwater management. And then our development group at the time, so this was pre-recession, was starting to grow. And we were really focused on infill urban developments, which are always contaminated. So I was kind of integrally involved in helping to do those developments in a way that financially could actually make sense. Which was great. And I really liked what I was doing. And then the recession hit and we were not buying any deals and we weren't developing anything. Yeah. And I needed to stay relevant and occupied. And so I connected with another one of my colleagues who ran our like utilities group, which is really focused on like billing RUBS, which is resident utility billing program. And together we were like, all right, we met, we had lunch, and we're like, we really should start a sustainability program here. And I had some extra capacity. And so we really, we spent a lot of time brainstorming. We got buy-in from our executive leadership and kicked off the first green team, back in the late aughts. That was
always a good place to start, the green team. Yep.
And that was a lot of, employee-facing initiatives, but it quickly turned into energy efficiency stuff by addressing low-hanging fruit. So lighting, some easy to underwrite solar, and a lot of rebate programs. So just switching out our appliances to more energy efficient appliances at the properties and getting lots of cash back for that. And that was fun. I really enjoyed doing both. But as we started to come out of the recession, we started buying a lot and developing a lot. And so after a couple of years of doing double duty of environmental and sustainability, I needed to step out of one. And I ended up going back to being full-time environmental compliance, really. And so that was really my focus for several years until like 2017, 2018. And at that time, the company had a kind of an initiative going on. We were looking at what is the world and the environment that our industry going to look like in 2030? And what are the things we're not thinking about that we should be thinking about? And we had a couple different teams that worked on all sorts of different topics. And I raised my hand and said, like, resilience is important. We should at least evaluate that and see if it's something we need to be thinking about. And to me, resilience risk and climate risk and physical risk is really similar to evaluating for environmental risk. So it was an easy thing for me to kind of step into and manage in a similar way of how we've handled our environmental risk. So since that time, we kind of realized, yes, this is important, and really built out our resilience program since 2018 to where it is now. And then in 2021, there were some like organizational changes at the company. And I took on leading our energy team with the main focus of decarbonizing our portfolio, which sort of combined the two parts of climate adaptation, reducing emissions and preparing for climate change.
Yeah, no, it's interesting how you went from compliance, which is a bit more of just, I guess, doing what's required of you versus this more proactive, trying to have foresight, what's around the corner in terms of risk sort of program and making it more resilient. So very cool. I have one kind of tangential question, and then we can get back to it. Mm-hmm. You mentioned birds. And when I think about buildings and real estate...
Strong start.
Yeah. You mentioned birds. And my understanding is buildings cause a lot of bird deaths. Is this something that has come up and you think about, or it's not a thing? I'm just curious.
Nope, that's a fair question. And since it falls under, and you can't see me doing quotes, environmental, all those things sort of have fallen on my desk over the years.
Yeah.
Literally or figuratively, Becky?
Oh, that's not good.
Yeah, I am inside right now, so not literally. But, we are less concerned about our buildings being places where birds come and get hit while they're flying. We do have restrictions on development where we need to consider endangered species and other aspects when we're doing our development. And if birds are an issue, which they often are in California, certain species, then we have to work and develop mitigation plans to address that during development so that we don't impact their habitat.
Interesting. Okay.
So that ornithology class has come in handy over the years.
All right, well, let's shift this back to EQR's resiliency journey, Becky. So by the time I joined a couple of years ago, I was lucky to have EQR already with a robust sustainability and resilience program. But I'm curious myself and listeners as well, when and how would you say EQR came to realize that this full-scale resilience program was necessary? I think you were talking about how maybe it advanced internally from our last question, but would you say, was it topics like internal risk evaluation that encouraged it along? Was it encouragement from some of our investors? How would you describe that progression?
So I actually think it was sort of phased. And initially it was done, like I said, back in 2017 or 2018 as part of our kind of big future thinking approach to what things would be like in 2030. And it was really in the beginning driven by asset preservation. So what did we need to be thinking about to make sure that our assets weren't going to be damaged in the same way that historically we've always looked at when we had properties in Florida, making sure they were prepared for hurricanes. Mm-hmm. Now we need to be thinking about flood today and flood in 20 years based on the current environment. So I do think that initially it was risk management. But then as we got closer to like 2020 and a little bit more into the program, we started to hear more from investors just asking, just kind of probing questions of like, are you thinking about this? What are you doing? To today, resiliency and resilience programs are kind of mandatory parts of the different reporting structures that we report into for sustainability. And then I don't know if you guys have been following along with the different SEC climate requirements, but climate risk is a huge part of that. And so it's sort of over time become something that was really driven by risk management and risk protection to now investor and regulatory requirements.
Well, I think that's really interesting, Becky. And when you think about it, pretty natural that EQR as a long-term hold company, meaning, when we buy a building, we're going to own it in perpetuity and not necessarily look to sell it, 5-10 years down the road, that this idea of risk starts to enter into the conversation more naturally as a long-term holder. And then it's cool to see that almost sounds like EQR had a step on the larger market as far as building out this program and understanding truly the importance of it. Would you think that's accurate?
No, I totally agree that I think because we're long-term holders, we do think long-term about the protection of our asset, whereas, merchant builders and other portfolio owners might have a 5-year hold. And so it's a different mindset when thinking about long-term impact, climate impact.
Okay, so Becky, as we've been unpacking EQR's resilience program. Thinking back again to the origins of it, did you find it difficult to achieve organization-wide buy-in to truly build out this resilience strategy?
So I actually found it much easier than expected to achieve organizational-wide buy-in, and I think that's really for two reasons. One, we first approached this as a risk mitigation program, right? And Equity as a company has a very proactive approach to risk avoidance versus having a preference for risk remediation after the fact. And so evaluation and planning to address current and future physical climate impact was kind of in line with many other programs that we already do related to risk management. But I think the other really important thing to mention is that it's hard to have a successful initiative and program without strong support from executive leadership. And our executive team has been strong supporters of our sustainability program since those early days of the Green Team. And their messaging to their respective teams of the importance of this work made it much easier to make sure we had the resources and the cooperation to help execute this kind of portfolio-wide program across the organization.
Excellent. I think that's a story more folks wish they could say, right? As they're championing sustainability or resilience efforts in their company, that there was more backing behind them to provide a true platform for them to do their work. But fantastic that you found it here.
Yeah, I feel really lucky. It made my work easier that I wasn't fighting an uphill battle.
Okay. And then I wanted to ask you about one of the things that I know you're trying to do to put in practice all the things that you all have come up with to be more resilient. And my understanding is that you did this portfolio-wide resilience study, and you wanted to identify key vulnerabilities and risks across your operating portfolio for flood risk, wildlife, extreme heat and drought, but also develop a list of priority assets for further investigation and potential risk mitigation. So what'd you find? Were you surprised, or have any actions come out of it? And how has it impacted that long hold strategy, the things that you purchased to put into that portfolio?
Starting in 2020, once we kind of committed to developing a program, we did asset-specific resilience studies. We did a few pilots of those, and we did some market-wide resilience studies in Boston and LA to look at different types of hazard impacts.
Yeah.
And then once we kind of understood what types of hazards we were interested in, what our tolerance was for different time frames and different emission scenarios, we put together that we wanted to do a desktop analysis, do a first round identification of where our risks were.
Desktop analysis, like just people sitting at the computer doing a research, maybe scoring things on a spreadsheet?
Kind of. I mean, it was a little bit more than that.
Okay.
I would say desktop only in that they weren't on site, correct.
Okay.
But what we had was a third party that had the hazard data that they put together, and that's geographic-based data of flood impact or wildfire.
Uh-huh.
And then our own internal team that have been at the properties many, many times completed asset surveys that identified all the vulnerabilities of the building. So construction type, because that makes an impact on vulnerability to flooding and flood damage. They looked at where critical equipment is located. Is it below grade? Is it at grade? Is it elevated? Looked at things like ground floor usage. Is it parking? Is it a hospital or a medical facility that's even higher risk? And so our on-site teams filled out these surveys, and then we sort of basically took the hazard information and compared it with the building vulnerability, and then looked at that against our own internal risk tolerance measures to identify the risk rating for every asset across the portfolio. It was not a small undertaking, not just a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Because again, tens of thousands of units that we manage, right, Becky? So lots to do.
Yeah. And you want to use that third party understanding of the risk of each of those properties would be a better result because it's from a third party, but then you don't have to develop it yourself.
Right. So we did have the third party data, but it's not as useful without the building vulnerability, because that really gets us to the point where we understand our true risk. And so I think that we wrapped that up last year. And I think what I think is great news from our study is that even in locations where an asset was maybe identified as being in a location with high hazard, like a flood zone or a wildfire risk area, which we had quite a few assets that are in those locations. But when we combine them with the building specific vulnerability information, very, very few assets were considered to be high risk based on our own internal thresholds. And I think less than 1% of our portfolio hit that threshold of high risk. And that was based on, we were looking at the unit of measurement of damage to our asset, or average annual loss. Less than 10% of our portfolio met our internal threshold that would require additional evaluation. So we've got, 30 to 40 assets or so that were flagged that this year we're completing that additional evaluation, which can range from, looking at the maps in real detail and seeing where the lat long or data point was, and then seeing where our building is located. And this is getting really in the weeds, but you might see that the data point is the address for the building, and it's located in a drainage ditch next to the street, which is intended to collect stormwater. And of course, that is considered a flood hazard, and your building is 200 feet away. And so right away, we can see that location is not actually a risk.
Got it. And so were you kind of lucky, or do you think people were thinking about this when you were choosing whether to purchase and develop a property, and that's why the results are so good?
Maybe a little bit of both.
Sure, we can do that.
I think for years, people did look at FEMA maps and might ask the question, but that was, FEMA is kind of backwards looking, so it's not perfect. I also think that our asset type tends to have ground floor usage that might not be as expensive to repair versus like a data center. So if we have a lobby get flooded, for example, then there's a cost to repair the flooring, but you can have the building still operating during that whole time while you're repairing the floor. So you don't have any loss of income or downtime. Whereas if a data center in the same location were to flood and it was just the first floor, that's a major problem. And so I think our asset class, in addition to luck, is kind of where we ended up where we are.
One thing I want to ask you is about your favorite examples of properties within EQR's portfolio that faced significant resilience risks that were mitigated by certain initiatives. So, you're saying overall the portfolio had good results, but could you zoom us in on maybe one property within the portfolio that you want to walk us through?
Can I share 2 examples?
By all means.
I don't know, Jay. What do you think? 2?
She came ready, Scott.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
All right.
Then I will decide, Becky, which one is cooler.
Sounds good to me.
So yes, go forth.
So I have 2, and I picked one that was more a capital investment that we did, and then one that's really more operational. And so the first one is an asset that we identified in the Northeast that was high hazard due to being along the coast. So it was going to have tidal impacts as well as increased rain and precipitation flooding. And so we flagged it as high risk during one of the pilots we did. But before we spent any money putting in mitigation, we brought in a third-party engineering firm to really look at the elevations specifically. And so they're able to kind of measure out, the flood projection elevations and where our building is and where the doors are to the elevator equipment room and where the lowest level is to the windows where water could come in. And so they kind of really dug in and came up with the true risk of impact based on the climate change projections, and then presented us with a handful of different solutions. And those solutions ranged quite wildly. Some were floodgates that would encase the entire property. your property would have no impact from any flood whatsoever. The challenges with that are that can be really expensive. And then there's logistical challenges with deploying that floodgate when you have like a 24-hour notice.
Sure.
So that wasn't, something that wasn't necessarily ideal, but we would have no impact. And then we looked all the way down to doing nothing and accepting the risk, or doing something in the middle. And what we ended up kind of designing was floodgates that specifically protected against impact to critical equipment rooms. So a generator, an elevator equipment room, fire pump rooms, stuff like that. And then we sort of accepted the risk that there might be some limited damage in the bottom level of the parking garage. But it's very limited and was not going to be worth the incremental cost to gate the entire community. So that's in effect, and we haven't actually had to deploy it, but we have a process in place now where we watch the tides when a storm's coming and determine if it's necessary.
Do the residents of this particular community know that there's a floodgate, or is that something that's just kind of done behind the scenes, ready and able when needed?
I'm sure they don't know it, but that's interesting. I wonder if they'd be interested to hear that.
Possibly.
Yeah, I would think so. And I want to hear number 2, but I just want to say with number 1, just read this book. It's called Decisive: How to Make Better Choices in Life and Work. Highly recommend it. And one of the things they talked about for making good decisions is getting out of the idea that it's all yes or no. There can be a middle ground or other options, not just whether to put in the floodgates or not. But there was a certain kind of floodgate you could put in. So very interesting that you all didn't just get caught up in, do we encase the whole thing in floodgates? No. Okay, then let's just do nothing.
That's a really interesting point. And I think it's one of my biggest takeaways in our approach to resilience is finding that middle ground and finding the right level of risk mitigation that makes the most sense for us. And so the other example I have is actually related to our wildfire risk assets.
Okay.
More assets that are in locations that have more frequent wildfires. So primarily California. And what we've been doing there is sort of a surgical approach to modifying landscaping and creating fire breaks. So instead of jumping in, and so when you're trying to create resilience related to wildfire hazards, one of the most important things to do is create a break and a fuel break so that there's space between the building and vegetation, or vegetation that's very dry.
Right.
Rather than just kind of across the board saying all the assets located in these locations need all vegetation removed 5 feet from the building. We're out there. I'm out there with our local team, walking the properties and understanding truly where the risk is coming from. So looking at the maps, looking at the historical fires in the area and the topography of the area, and really targeting modifications to landscaping in very specific locations at those properties that will make the biggest impact for the cost. So that has been kind of fun that we've realized, that we've realized there is a way to approach these reducing risk without having to spend huge amounts of money.
I think I like the first one better because it allowed me to say that I read a book, even though fire's cool. So
fire or flood, I guess.
in the right, situation, fire's cool. But anyway, Jay, go forth. Next question, please.
Okay, so more or less, thus far in the conversation, we've been talking about the portfolio that EQR already owns. However, and we were laughing before this interview started recording that Scott called me Chandler from Friends and that he doesn't necessarily know what I do. Well, Scott, maybe this is like a helpful cue. So I bring that up to say that when I am looking at a new potential development opportunity, so something that EQR would invest in to build and then acquire to add into this portfolio, or if I'm working alongside our team that looks to go out and just purchase a completed existing building, resiliency factors into that. So the question to you, Becky, is as EQR increases its portfolio, how does resilience factor into our due diligence, our analysis of these new potential projects? This
actually, we sort of got our arms around before we even started our whole portfolio review, because it was a little easier to tackle new stuff coming in and making sure we got that right. What we do when we're looking at an asset is usually during the due diligence period, that time period between signing a contract and going hard on the contract and definitely buying the deal, we look at many different things, including my old school environmental due diligence. And early on in that process, we do a in-house resilience review. So we look at the climate risk data that we get from our third party. I look at FEMA. I look at wildfire maps and historic wildfire maps, and we understand the geographic risk. And so right off the bat, if there is kind of any red flags, based on that initial review, we then have a conversation about the building vulnerability to really understand the true risk. And so we might find out that an asset is right next to a river that has a great berm that's well funded and well maintained, and that the building itself is not at risk at all, and either is the surrounding infrastructure. And so we can get comfortable even when there's those initial flags with moving forward with an asset. On the flip side, when we find an asset where the infrastructure around it is at risk, so the surrounding streets are going to be flooded, even if the asset's elevated and not showing as risk, that's where it becomes more difficult because you can't mitigate your surrounding infrastructure. We don't have control over that. And those are harder conversations to have on how to move forward with a deal when it's the surrounding infrastructure that can be impacted besides just the building.
Got it. And Becky, this is actually pretty topical because you and I actually had a conversation about this not too long ago where we were looking at a site that had really cool riverfront access and immediate access to a trail network that went all, I think for 100 miles around this particular site. And I think we saw that this site could be in, increasingly severe floodplains. As I know, Becky, on your end, you can toggle different greenhouse gas emission scenarios to figure out, the perhaps exact degree that this site might be impacted. And I think perhaps even earlier in this conversation to this, not necessarily a black and white yes and no type answer, Becky, your questions helped us do some additional digging. I think there's still more that we'll chat with you about this particular project, but it was interesting to then understand that this is a risk and then have that catalyst to do additional research into the city and actually say, okay, actually there's some pretty large scale infrastructure work that's happening in this city to increase levee strength, etc. So very pertinent, Becky, what you're discussing here.
Yeah. The city impact and on how they're handling and planning for infrastructure is definitely part of the bigger conversation on both existing and new development and new acquisitions. So, Jay, I'm curious to hear more about what you guys found as you dug into that site because it looked cool. It looked like it might flood.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're not trying to open up a surf shop here, Becky. But no, I think there's certainly more digging to be done. But Becky, to your earlier comment, I really credit the city where this parcel is located because they have a extremely comprehensive website devoted purely to their levee system improvements, talking about where their funding is coming from, how the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was involved to help with design, really thorough research that I think on our side as investors helps us make an educated decision. Again, Becky, with your help about, hey, is this actually an asset that we not only want to operate because we think people would really enjoy living here, but is this a resilient asset to add to our portfolio? It's been very interesting.
And so I guess bottom line, Becky, are there examples in your head of where the company has said, we were going to invest in this, then we looked at the resilience aspect of it, and now we're not?
Yes.
Okay, so it is that important at times.
It is that important right now. Yeah. I don't think it was 5 years ago. So the asset I was telling you about, that we put the floodgates up, we bought that a couple years before we started the resilience program. I'm not sure we would have bought that today, or we would have bought it and underwritten the floodgate mitigation program into it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Usually now, if someone's looking at an acquisition or development, before it's even under contract, if there's any kind of location concerns before flood or wildfire, they're kind of reaching out to my team sooner rather than later so we can do that preliminary review and then not get too far into the deal before realizing it's a risk that we just aren't okay taking.
That makes sense. And that's so important to sustainability, even like in designing packaging, having it on the front end of the design of the packaging, considering recyclability and other things before you get too far down the line is important and saves time. So one thing we wanted to ask you about, and I know we talked about in the introduction, was these local and statewide regulations. Can you talk a bit about how EQR is engaging in climate-related regulations to make sure that it's helpful to you and not a hindrance?
I really like this aspect of my job, and the climate related regulations seem to be currently more focused on energy emissions reduction, which is also in my world. But we're equity is in a unique position that in many of our markets, we are one of, or sometimes the largest owner of multifamily units in that city. And so our voice is one that they listen to. And whether it's through local industry groups. So like in New York, we work closely with the Real Estate Board of New York, which is REBNY.
Gotta love associations.
Yep. And there's a lot of them, but I won't go into all of them. And then in some of our cities, we work directly on city task forces to help develop those policies and give them the owner feedback. And kind of our goal is to, equity as a company has sustainability goals for 2030, emissions reduction targets and water reduction targets. So just like the cities that have a carbon neutrality target of 2040, we're all working towards the same goal. But I think it's key that we provide the feedback so that their program and their regulations are written in a way that the building owners can comply and participate in a way that makes financial and logistical sense. So just telling us we need to reduce everything in 5 years on a building that was built 10 years ago doesn't make sense. Pulling out new equipment just to meet that target, but working to have a long-term goal that meets our goals and the cities is really the direction we try to steer those policies.
That makes sense. And is there a regulation in particular that you push for that you think is just so important to have in place?
I wouldn't say that we're pushing to have any regulations put in place, but
or removed.
And I don't even know if we're removing them, but more so influencing them so that they make sense. So like Seattle, for example, I think is a good example of where the city had a task force for 2 years with many different stakeholders. I mean, it included the more advocacy groups like NRDC, but it also had affordable housing owners, it had public school owners, it had us, it had hotels and commercial. And I think we had 12 meetings over a 2-year period giving feedback, and their policy they developed, I think, is really good. It allows you to opt into a very long-term compliance goal that you can work with the end of your building life cycle and have time for technology to kind of catch up and pricing to stabilize and the grid to stabilize. Well, in Seattle, that's less of a concern because they have mostly clean energy. But really, I like what they did, and it just makes sense from an owner's and a city regulatory perspective.
Yeah, I love that example and having all those stakeholders engaged on it.
Stakeholder and the private-public partnerships are really key for a lot of this work.
Totally.
So Becky, let's now turn our attention to the future. Where do you think EQR, we can say, is currently in its portfolio-wide mitigation plan? And then what are the next steps as you look to make the portfolio as resilient as possible?
I wouldn't say we're early in our resilience program, or maybe we're in the middle of where I'd like us to be.
Sure.
I think that we have a really good foundation of understanding our portfolio's risk, our acquisitions process, mitigation options. Like, we're in great shape there. And over the next year, as we finish these deeper evaluations of the higher risk assets and implement these mitigation plans, which could be, like we talked about, accepting some level of risk or fully mitigating it, or identifying that there is no actual risk. I think we're in good shape there. Where I see a long way to go is related to the infrastructure surrounding our assets, which we have a lot less control over. And, both the federal and local governments and how they're planning for resiliency for the city and for their infrastructure is a huge part of how we think of our own assets resiliency, because our asset can be protected by floodgates, but if the power is knocked out because the street outside our asset is completely flooded, it's still not helpful for us. And I think the other piece that I'd like us to kind of keep exploring and working on is related to how we electrify our portfolio over time and grid reliability and backup power. Because as we're focused on decarbonizing our portfolio, we'll have more and more buildings over time that will rely on electricity for heat. And then it becomes more critical that that power isn't disrupted. And, there's some markets we're in where there's somewhat unreliable power supply. And we kind of need to continue to explore different options for backup power and what we can do there to have more resilient buildings on the power side.
Okay, so Becky, perhaps our last question for you about the future here is whether you see any game-changing innovations on the horizon that you think could help bolster resilience throughout EQR's portfolio. And I think this is perhaps a very timely question for you, as you were just added as an advisor to CRETEC's new Climate Venture Coalition. So congratulations on that.
Thanks. Yeah, they're a fun group to be part of. But it's really, they're looking at different climate tech. So it's more exposure for me and for Equity to see different startups that are coming down the line or being presented. There are so many smart people focused on climate tech in the climate tech field right now. Although most of it is focused on energy related tech and solutions. I have not seen very much as it relates to resilience. So I think, when it comes to new game-changing innovations that will support our resilience program, it's going to be around backup power and grid interactivity, and help us solve for that part of my future worries. As our cities transition to that carbon-free economy, it's just going to have to happen. And so I'm seeing a lot of cool things like more innovative backup power solutions that are integrated into the building that I'm sure down the road we'll be excited to be piloting. But I also think that as we look at physical resilience and protecting our assets, we really need to look at some of the more low-lying cities in Europe that are way ahead of us and incorporate some of their really cool flood mitigation technologies and the barriers that they have, and then figure out how to finance that, because these are city-driven programs. So, not so much something that Equity can address on our own, but that we as collectively as a community will need to work on.
Fantastic.
All right. So, Becky, we want to move to our traditional last question here. Jay, what would be an EQR property that would make sense to be at a party?
Great question, Scott. How about I answer selfishly and say one of our new buildings that we're opening up here in Denver?
Okay. So we're at this new building in Denver and we're like, okay, this is cool real estate, but we got to make sure I'm sure they made sure it's resilient. They did their desktop analysis, all those good things. And we are there at a party, though, with people that have not listened to this episode and are intrigued by what we've just said. And we want to hit them with one party fact about resilience in real estate. What do we hit them with?
So I don't have the exact stats for City of Denver, but globally, buildings make up 40% of the world's emissions. So in cities where we're located, so Denver included, it's somewhere between 60 to 90% because less driving, less emissions from industrial. And so I think the interesting thing around that 60 to 90% of the emissions are from buildings is that the building you're living in and your day-to-day, if we can address reduction in emissions at a large scale, which at Equity, we do have the opportunity to do that, we can have a real impact on the trajectory of global emissions, which hopefully will help us plan for less resilience concerns down the road.
I hadn't thought about that. That as you reduce emissions in some of those other high emitting sectors, buildings become even that much more important. And like you're saying, you're already seeing that in the places you all operate, because my understanding is you tend to prioritize places where there's transit. So wow, buildings make up 60 to 90% of emissions in those particular places. Yeah. Crazy.
Awesome. Well, I'm a little sad to bring this conversation to a close, but I think that'll wrap it up for us here. We want to thank you so much for joining us to share your expertise on a topic that Scott, now knowing what I do, can understand my passion for, but I am certain that our listeners out there as well are going to be much better informed after this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. That was really fun. I enjoyed it and kind of want to come back now. So.
Be careful what you wish for.
Thankfully, I get to work with Jay still. So,
yes.
Becky, thank you.
Thank you both. I really appreciate it.
All right, Definers, we are so excited to be joined today by Lindsay Brugger. She is the Vice President, Urban Resilience at the Urban Land Institute, here to help us continue to break down resiliency in residential real estate. So, Lindsay, thank you so much for jumping on with us today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
All right, so let's start from your background. We saw that you began your career as an architect. So, our first question to you is, was sustainability and resilience always an interest of yours that perhaps ran parallel to your architecture practice, or was this something that you gravitated to over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it was always kind of there. I became an architect because I really believe that the built environment has the power to create positive outcomes. And that's what resilience is all about. We often talk about resilience as just about risk mitigation, and there's so much more to resilience. It's really an opportunity to create the places and spaces that we want to see that can thrive in the long term.
All right, so Lindsay, you're focused on resilience, and your team is providing excellent resources for real estate owners and developers managing natural hazards like droughts, floods, wildfire, extreme heat. So that's a lot for people to consider as they're designing their real estate. So how do you find people navigate through one or more of these categories? Is it difficult to manage all of them? Why or why not?
Yeah, it's tempting to focus on just one hazard and think that that's the only thing that could ever affect you. But the reality is it's rare that a development would only have to face one type of hazard. And that's where I like to look at the co-benefits. Finding the strategies that can reduce your vulnerability to multiple hazards while also providing other benefits. So, for example, green infrastructure. We love green infrastructure. It can do a lot of things. It can reduce flood risk while also reducing our urban heat island, and then has another benefit of recharging our groundwater to help address drought and water scarcity. You could even layer in further and think about the social benefits that might come with other strategies, or even the energy reducing opportunities with, say, a very efficient building envelope that can help with extreme heat, can also bring our energy costs down. A bike trail could help to provide recreational opportunities and also provide a fire break around a community to help with the wildfire resilience. So there's a lot of opportunities to find these co-benefits. And one of the resources that I'll give a shout out to is the Developing Resilience Toolkit that ULI created in partnership with Mill Creek Residential. It is a process to understand your hazard exposure and reduce your vulnerability. But what's most exciting to a lot of our members who utilize this resource is that it includes a matrix of over 140 different strategies for 9 different hazards, and all of the co-benefits associated with those strategies are also listed out.
That's a fantastic resource, Lindsay, and I'm happy to say that we actually pointed folks to that in our introduction, and really just gave them a small taste of it because it is so thorough. But yes, I think that is a fantastic resource for folks that are looking to jump into this further. And I do want to ask, when you say green infrastructure is kind of one of the components of resiliency that you mentioned, how would you define green infrastructure for definers that might be unfamiliar?
Yeah, green infrastructure can manifest in a lot of different ways. It might be a rain garden. It might be a park. It might be a bioswale. So it's really ways of using the natural environment to enhance our developments and also combat some of these physical climate challenges that we're talking about.
And then what about building envelope?
Another good one to catch. Thank you. A building envelope is the enclosure of a building. So some might call it a facade, really the exterior walls and the makeup of those walls. So the insulation, the windows, the structure, all of those elements that create the skin of a building.
So no stamp required, but you still want that thing tightly closed.
Exactly. I can't leave my architect hat completely behind.
Scott, now I'm thinking of like that aftertaste you get after going to close an envelope, which I'm happy we don't have to really discuss here on this topic.
No, it killed Susan in Seinfeld. We don't want that.
Quick pause. I got to say, I'm rewatching Seinfeld at this point, and I haven't yet gotten to that episode, Scott. So I'm eagerly waiting.
I just ruined Seinfeld for you.
That's okay. That's all right. It's been out for 20 years. I had this coming.
Yeah.
Okay, so Lindsay, segueing off of the green infrastructure that you helped us define just a minute ago, you have some fantastic case studies of resilience work for residential buildings on your website. One of our favorites is the Clipper Ship Wharf project in Boston, which designed a, quote, living shoreline that allows tides to move in and out of the site naturally, restoring the intertidal ecosystem and protecting residential units from coastal flooding and sea level rise. It's really quite amazing. Could you tell us how this and other resilience strategies created value for this project?
Living shorelines are another great example of green infrastructure. So excellent segue. And this Clipper Ship Wharf project in particular is a wonderful example of how resilience creates value. In addition to the living shoreline, they elevated their ground plane. They created significant green space with native plantings that help to absorb rainfall. They have redundancy in their building system. So they have a central plant that has multiple air handling units that allow continued operations in the event of a major disaster. And they also have solar panels and even deployable flood barriers. And all of those resilience strategies really add up. They estimate that if they were to experience a major storm, they would avoid $2 million in claims per storm. And then in addition to that, they don't even have to wait for the disaster to happen to reap the benefits of resilience. They had 5 to 10% rental premium. They were able to have their building 96% leased less than a year after it opened. And they also saw that the first 80 condo units sold in just 8 weeks. So they're really seeing that being able to tell the story of, yes, we are a waterfront development, and yes, that comes with risk, but here's how we mitigated that risk so that you all can enjoy this waterfront living.
I would encourage folks to check out the website. I think there are some pictures on it that show just how natural the shoreline actually looks. Not at all necessarily manufactured. I am curious, Lindsay, obviously there are tons of downstream benefits, so to speak, of investing in resilience upfront. I'm curious if this particular client, had a strong will to invest in these technologies, which, we see on our side is, can sometimes increase the development budget for a particular project. So was this particular partner of yours willing to invest upfront in that, understanding that as you're describing on the back end, they would be reaping some of those benefits?
And so that project was developed by Lend-Lease, who is one of ULI's very active members. And Lend-Lease has a really leading edge approach to their developments. So it's not at all surprising to me that they included resilience. What we're starting to see is more and more of our ULI members recognize that climate risk is financial risk, and they need to do more than disclose that. They can't just follow the regulations that are requiring the disclosure, because then that leaves a big question mark in future buyers' minds of whether or not that building can perform in the event of a major disaster. So by taking control of that narrative and saying, yes, I am going to disclose these risks that I'm legally obligated to tell you or that my investors are asking about, and I'm going to talk to you about how I have mitigated those hazards and those risks so that you're making a sound investment.
Fantastic.
And do you have any other case studies of buildings that you think have done a nice job of increasing their resilience? And it could be both in terms of their infrastructure, but also in terms of what you were just talking about, like how they're communicating about it.
I would be happy to. We have a whole bunch on developing urban resilience, which is an interactive online library of projects and policies that demonstrate how resilience creates value. So if we go out to Boise, Idaho, Aviemore Development is a master plan community. faced high fire risk. So they became a registered FireWise community. They included recreational trails and road networks that could act as fuel breaks as well as ensure emergency egress. In their buildings, they used wildfire resistant material like cementitious siding, Class A roofs. And then they were really careful about the landscaping that they selected to make sure that it wouldn't be kindling in a future fire. And this paid off. They experienced fires very close to their property in both 2016 and 2018. And while the fire was directly adjacent to the property, no people and no structures were harmed. So that really shows the benefit of recognizing your risk and addressing it.
Did you say there were nature trails that served as fire breakers?
Recreational trails, yes.
Recreational trails.
Recreational trails and road networks surrounded the development. And that means that the fire can't just keep going because there's pavement.
I love it. It's also what you were talking about, like with co-benefits and social benefits, like having those trails there. If I were a resident, I'd be like, this is awesome. I love using these trails and it gives me a chance to walk or bike or whatever it is. And maybe they're aware of it, maybe they're not, this fire benefit. But yeah, I love that it's not just some break in the vegetation to reduce the risk of fire, but also to have this benefit of recreation.
Absolutely. And that's the opportunity in resilience that I really see.
Lindsay, you recently wrapped up your 2024 Resilience Summit in New York City, which convenes industry leaders in real estate and resilience from around the world to address the challenges and harness the opportunities posed by climate risks. So the question for you is, what insights from this year's summit do you find most insightful?
This year's summit was record-breaking for us. We had a record number of attendees. We had a record number of sessions, and it was just a really fantastic, energizing day. So there are a lot of insights that I could share, but the one that I think I'll uplift is one of the things that was special about this event is we also launched our latest report with LaSalle Investment Management at the event. And that report is focused on physical climate risk and underwriting practices. And we use that report to kind of introduce a framework to help investment managers evaluate the level of exposure to physical climate risk and the financial implications of that risk, and then to identify the hazard mitigation strategies and estimated associated costs of mitigating those physical climate risks versus the cost of doing nothing. And then they are able to use that framework to determine a risk-adjusted return and whether or not that return meets firm objectives. And when we were talking about all of that, Julie Manning with LaSalle made a really excellent point, because the first step of evaluating the level of exposure, a lot of investment managers use climate risk analytic tools to help kind of flag the high risk properties. And
sure,
I know you talked earlier about some of these climate risk analytic tools. And what I really appreciated from Julie is that the tool and the data that comes from the tool is not an answer in and of itself. You still need that human element, that human analysis to understand the assumptions behind the data and to apply that data to your investment decision-making process.
Well, it's good to hear humans still have a role in all of this.
No robots.
No robots. Yeah, I'm waiting for the robots to take over networking as well. Just zooming out a little bit, and I know your conference does a nice job of looking at the whole landscape, but we want to talk with you about like residential real estate. Do you find that it's far enough along? Like, I feel like some of the stuff we're talking about of like, oh, invest more up front and you get all these co-benefits, like it seems like a no-brainer. But if we looked at a representative sample of residential buildings in a big city, would we still find that most of them are missing these things they can do to improve resilience? Or would you find, at least with the newer buildings, most everyone's doing it?
I wish I could say that we're really far along, but I think we still have a ways to go. There is increasing awareness of the need for resilience. We see that disasters are increasing in frequency and intensity. We see that there are rising insurance premiums. There are increased disclosure requirements. So there is this awareness happening and this education. And I think as consumers become more aware of the risks that they face, there's going to in turn be a higher demand for the type of properties that include resilient strategies. We actually saw that Redfin did a study recently where they disclosed the flood risk of certain properties to prospective home buyers. And they found that those home buyers, once they saw the level of risk that was associated with the property they were interested in, they actually changed their minds and they bid on the properties that had a lower flood risk, which is exactly what you would hope would happen. But I think that demonstrates the importance of awareness and education in making informed decisions. And MLS listings now include this type of climate data. So we're already starting to see the residential space foster that type of education and create more informed buyers.
I told you before we started the interview that I was planning on moving to Annapolis. And I know you said you have moved to Edgewater, which just in the name, Edgewater. I mean, I imagine a lot of people there are thinking about this. I mean, was that when you were looking for where you were moving to there, did you see a lot of disclosure? And was it something, were you able to navigate through what is the flood risk of the properties I'm looking at?
Yeah, so flood risk was very much on my radar.
I would think.
Yes, I can't get away from it. And when I bought in DC, I made sure to map out all the floodplains and not buy in one. Moving out towards the Chesapeake Bay, it's a lot harder to avoid the floodplain. And what I didn't tell you about where I live is I'm actually doing this interview from a 47-foot sailboat that I live on.
What?
So I have my own climate adaptation plan right here.
What? That's like where you live. Live.
That is where I live.
Oh my goodness.
And was this in part because, do you love sailboats, or was it just because you can just roll with wherever the water is?
I do love sailing, and in order to do more sailing and have waterfront property that wasn't going to float away, I figured let's just dive right in and live on a sailboat.
No pun intended.
Oh my God. I love that. I'm glad I asked. Okay. Well, I don't know if I can make the leap to living on a sailboat, but I highly respect your choice.
Thank you.
And I guess last thing for me, you talked about the study from Redfin, but is there any study that looks at, of the new buildings built in New York City in the past year, X% have a certain level of resilience built in? Is there some sense of, when you're looking citywide or statewide or countrywide, I don't know, what percent of new buildings, because what's just old buildings, let's give them a break, but the new buildings that they're considering this?
So I think the best way to look at that is through building codes. A lot of times when we're talking about resilience, we all jump to these extra things we can do, which are critical and super important, especially if you're going to build in a high risk area. But not every building needs to be resilient. If you're really thoughtful about your site selection, you may not need to invest in strategies that are over and above what the code already requires. And our building codes are getting stronger and better at protecting both people and property from hazard events. And interestingly, FEMA now has a building code adoption tracking tool that talks about which jurisdictions and municipalities have adopted the most recent model building codes. And so you can use building codes as some level of proxy to get to that exact question that you were asking about which buildings are better prepared for our future climate.
Very interesting. So continuing this thread, Lindsay, we're talking about FEMA now. In the introduction of this episode, we talked about riskfactor.com. So my question for you is, for large residential owners facing real estate resilience questions, are there any other specific tools you find most helpful when evaluating either portfolio-wide or individual asset climate risk? And then as a second part to that question, how might your guidance change for individual homeowners?
So I'm going to be completely biased and say my favorite tool is ULI's report, How to Choose, Use, and Better Understand Climate Risk Analytics, which helps our members ask thoughtful questions about all of these different softwares that can provide the type of data that you're talking about, because there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of tools out there, and each one has its own application. And so it's important for the user to say, here's what my business objectives are. Let's talk about how your tool can or cannot best serve my objectives. And so the report that we offered, and this is another one that we did with LaSalle, offers a series of questions for investment managers to ask when evaluating a given tool so that they know that they're getting a product that is going to serve them best.
And then what about just general individual homeowner, your typical listener of the show looking to buy a home? What tools would you recommend they use?
Yeah, so I love the fact that sites like Redfin and Realtor.com do include climate risk data. And I think that's a good kind of first pass at what the hazard exposure is. A lot of jurisdictions are also being very active in how they mitigate their risk at a market scale to protect their residents and to continue to draw development. And so I think it's a multi-pronged approach. Looking at what's on the MLS listing is a good first kind of red flag.
Sure.
And then if you want to dive deeper, you can look at the hazard mitigation plan that a city might have. In order to receive federal funding after a disaster, a jurisdiction has to have a hazard mitigation plan. And that'll tell you not just what the hazards are in the area, but how the municipality is planning to address those. So you can get a sense of whether or not the municipality has the political will, the financial capacity, and the technical expertise to draw down some of these risks at a larger market scale.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And so, Lindsay, perhaps a follow-on to that, for those interested in residential real estate resiliency, how would you suggest they get more deeply involved, whether they own real estate or not?
Well, you have lifted up a lot of wonderful resources from ULI, so thank you for that. And I encourage folks to check those out. There's a whole bunch of goodies on uli.org/resilience. And then if you missed the Resilience Summit, you're having a little bit of FOMO, come on down to Savannah, May 13th to 14th.
Ooh, Savannah, nice.
Yeah, Savannah. It's going to be amazing. We're going to have a Southeast Coastal Development Forum, and there's going to be tours. There's going to be lots of networking opportunities and a lot of really good information to help the real estate community live with water.
Love it.
Okay. I have not been to Savannah, so I am jealous that you and others are going to get to go.
Hey, you can join us too.
I'm going to look it up for sure. I do want to move to our final question, though. So let's pretend that we're on a party boat. Maybe it's a sailboat. I'm not sure. But we're feeling good. We're on the water. And there's people we don't know there, and we start talking to them about where they live and their flood risk, and I'm sure they're loving this conversation. We're telling them there might be some issues for them. But we want to hit them with something about residential real estate that is going to cause them to be like almost fall off the boat because they're just like, I can't believe you just told me that, as they stagger backwards. What is this one thing about residential real estate we can tell them?
So since the 1980s, NOAA has tracked the number of disasters that have occurred that cost $1 billion or more, and that's adjusted for inflation. And since 1980, there have been 378 of these billion-dollar disasters, which cumulatively exceed over $2.5 trillion. And the thing that I'll say about that $2.5 trillion number, to me, isn't even the most staggering piece of this fun fact, this fun party fact. The most staggering point about this is that's only the disasters that cost $1 billion or more. So that is not including any of the disasters that were $900 million in damages. So that $2.5 trillion number is very conservative.
Yeah, and I'm sure that number, you said that was since 1980, right?
Yep.
I have to think that there's been an upward trajectory in those sort of disasters as well, which is more disheartening and more reason to get on it, right?
It is, yes. It's absolutely a hockey stick. The disasters are increasing in frequency and intensity. And all of this, I have to say, I know it sounds like a party mood killer of a fact, but I go back to the opportunity, right? Because when we're faced with challenges like this, we're forced to act. And that action can create incredible opportunities.
Well, I love the positive spin, and we appreciate your time. And hopefully one of these days I'm going to see your boat, because that sounds awesome.
Come out anytime.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you.
Lindsay, thank you. All right, Scott. Well, it turns out in the time we've been talking, insurance rates, ever so hot, have gone up again. So I'm just going to peel off and rerun some numbers real quick.
Now, I want to make fun of you, but I respect your spreadsheet skills. So we'll just let it be.
I am humbled.
Who do we want to thank, Jay?
All right. Well, we want to thank Taylor Price for another set of stellar intro notes. We'd like to thank Keaton Butler as our audio editor, making us sound so good. We also want to thank Becky Becker for the time she spent in helping us with the introduction. Thank you, Becky.
Okay. We also encourage you to please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this. Jay, no reviews.
No reviews.
So we have nothing to read, and it's very sad because I really enjoy reading reviews.
Oh, I'm coming across one.
What? Where?
Dear Scott, I very much enjoy working with you and sharing information with our listeners. I think that was just a note I wrote to myself.
Well, I still appreciate the note. Can you send that to me?
Sure, happily.
Thank you. All right, well, hopefully either Jay will send me more notes or we'll get reviews from listeners so we can read those.
Excellent.
All right, I think that about does it. You all stay sustainable out there. I'm Scott Breen.
And I'm Jay Siegel. We'll see you next time.